Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome everyone again to my first live stream of the year. And what a great subject and an even better guest that we have on to really kick us off for 2026. And I don't know, he's going to be relatively relevant to what's going on in the news right now. Sometimes I get lucky with that. So we're going to cover when nations weaponize, well, everything. We're going to talk about China versus the US, Venezuela, quantum, AI, and effectively the new rules of wealth for investors and wealthy families. We have a lot to discuss. So, of course, I'm going to kick off the year with a long form interview. A heads up, we're estimating 2 hours, about 1 hour in. We'll take a 90-second, 2-minute kind of quote unquote intermission. So I very much look forward to this. And it is the return. It's been like 16 months and the world is completely changed. Yeah. The return of the one and only Michael Irish, US Marine Special Forces, founder of SedoGravitas, and a space leader. And we're going to talk about that as well. I didn't even mention that in the title, but we do have 2 hours to work with. So we have a lot of time and a lot of things to cover. I'm going to start with welcome, Michael, to the show. Happy New Year and great to see you again.
Thank you, Angelo. Happy New Year to you. It's a privilege to be with you. And yeah, the world has changed. And the last several months and even the pivot between last year and this year have shown profound change that are requiring me to do a lot more reading and thinking and communicating around the world. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Angelo, for the forum.
You're very kind. We'll get right to it. We're going to start our first theme until, of course, I get off track, which will always happen, is not much changes, but that's a New Year's resolution of mine. Let's see if I could do a better job of that. With kind of the USA versus China, we're going to take, at least initially, a little bit of a different look and perspective at it. So kind of separate supply chains, separate internet, separate AI ecosystems among the two global powers. It appears to be a Cold War. Venezuela, which we'll get more to in about 10 minutes, but we'll play a little bit broadly into this question. Like, I don't know, does the world outside of those two countries and do families and family offices kind of need, quote unquote, to choose sides? It's a very open-ended question because it may lead you to dollar dominance, stable coins, the impact on continuing dollar dominance, the rise of AI and who's going to win, and controlling each of our quote unquote hemispheres. That word control was a strong word, but I did use it purposely. So it's open-ended to kickstart our geopolitical conversation. Michael, what do you think?
It's a super complicated question, and I'm going to try and address it in multiple facets. You know, when I went to university, I did a couple different, theses, right? And one of which was, taking a very close look at China and, how we could actually relate to them. And this goes back, obviously, decades. I think the challenge that we have right now, especially in reading the national security strategy for the United States, I think there's a lot of very good points in there. I also think that if we start to break the world up into geographies, effectively balkanizing with the centers of gravity regionally being China and the US at a minimum, I don't exactly know how to define Europe vis-a-vis Russia. I think these constructs of breaking the world into three effective parts dismisses the technology and geopolitical and trade relationships that we have now that we did not have 50, 80, or 100 years ago. And so therefore, my initial observation, not conclusion, because we may end up there anyway, is that if you look at, I had a meeting with an individual in the agricultural industry today, and their entire supply chain globally is in fits. They don't know what to do. They can't do any strategic planning because they have dependencies in markets with China, number one, that are a very large percentage of their company. And so my observation is that if we start to carve up the world by geography, that dismisses the role of space It dismisses the role of instantaneous communications, the internet, cyber, banking, the fluidity and access to global capital. As a man who advises, entrepreneurs in AI, quantum, post-quantum, and space, the notion of closing off the world to any country outside this U.S. sphere of influence for capital, technology, or human resources is almost antithetical to the capitalist zeal and spirit and the fundamentals of this country. I am not one for disengagement on any level until it's absolutely necessary. Are we in a Cold War? Sure, but we're almost in a hot war with Russia, and we seem to be continuing to talk to them. I think that it is China's interest and our interest not to kill the relationship. For one, I don't think we're prepared in any respect to let go of Japan, South Korea, our long-term allies, and Taiwan, or Australia, or Singapore. I think that the role that all those countries play respectively, whether it's technology, human resources, or capital, and also markets for the US are vast. And so information moves at light speed. Information does not respect boundaries. Yeah, you can try and curtail it. Yes, you can try and firewall it. But at the end of the day, the construct of using geography as a model, I think, is unfortunately dismissing all the technology advances that we've had over the last 150 years.
I did so purposely, Michael, and obviously my audience knows I'm very active in the technical front, mainly with AI, but very intrigued by space tech, which we'll get to, in quantum. But since we last connected, so much has changed. I'm going to continue a little bit on that questioning. One, we have a new president, and President Trump. Again, we haven't connected in a long time. So a lot has changed from that perspective. Globalism has been the thing. We could argue for decade after decade, and may have even served a purpose, and will continue to do so. But we are seeing changes. We are seeing decoupling. We are seeing trade agreements that are being renegotiated. Tariffs, which I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get deeply into more of the macro aspect, but all things that are very different in this administration than in past, broadly speaking, including, of course, other Republicans. We're going to get to Venezuela because that's going to be an important part of it. But we're seeing the reshoring here in America, and important things to AI and space tech, I'm assuming, is going to be critical metals, minerals, where we have a fair amount. We have relationships with countries that have a fair amount. For political reasons, we just don't process them. And China dominates. Therefore, in pharmaceuticals, in processing of precious metals, and broadly manufacturing, China has massive, massive advantages. Could we truly decouple that cleanly? Should we? I'm assuming your answer is no. And what's going to be a compromise?
Right. Number one, there's so many layers to that question. So let me try and think about it before I speak precisely. It is my viewpoint as kind of a guy that's a little bit on the hawkish side of foreign policy, as well as trade, that the trade relationships that we've had for the most part over the last 20 to 30 years have largely been to the benefit of our trading partners as opposed to the benefit of us. Okay, if we're talking about the U.S. as a nation state. Going all the way back, I'm aging myself, but I did do trade policy and technology policy in the late 90s and early part of this millennium. I think we've left a lot of relationships really imbalanced, number one. And number two is that, I remember working on the critical technologies list in the late 90s, okay? I remember raising, the hammer, raising the flag, not the hammer, but eventually it became a hammer, and talking about the dependency on rare earth minerals and the fact that they were going to be critical elements to the supply chain. China had a strategy for rare earth minerals going back decades. And I beg the question, did we? And I think the answer is no. And I have, firsthand information about the Chinese either purchasing outright and or co-locating mines for the purpose of gaining access to rare earth minerals in this country. And we let them. We knew about it and we let them do it. Now, why we let them do it, there are so many things about the last administration that signal apathy or a lack of understanding or both. That doesn't mean everything they were doing was wrong. What it means is that there's a whole bunch of things that fell through the cracks. You know my position on immigration. That fell through the cracks. Rare earth minerals fell through the cracks. There's a lot of things that are strategic variables, not only for our supply chain, but our industrial base and a million other things. But if we're going to basically build a dividing line between the two hemispheres and between the US and China, we better make sure that we have the independent and organic capacity to do the manufacturing, to do the mining, to source the minerals, and have the industrial base or post-industrial base to do what we need to do. And I don't think we have effectively thought through that. If you want to build a semiconductor factory or a pharmaceutical factory, this isn't something that is either capital non-intensive. It takes a heck of a lot of money to do that. You have to have the research, you have to have the human labor, and the supply chain agreements that go into making pharmaceuticals. So my point being here, Angelo, is that we allowed ourselves to go into a false construct of what free trade is. Free trade with dependencies is not a good idea for any nation state. And I've long argued that we should have food independence, water independence, fuel independence, manufacturing independence. But that's not a message that a lot of companies want to hear because they're constantly looking for sources of low-cost production. So if we're willing to basically upend the entire economic model of the country at this juncture and build dividing lines that are false constructs and look at shortages for heparin, other pharmacological products that we actually need, as well as a lot of technology that we require, Apple can't just go out and build another iPhone factory. It isn't that simple, right? And so we need to think through our vulnerabilities and dependencies and things that can be used against us before we go and cross the line of no return.
Well, there certainly is vulnerabilities and challenges, and we're for sure in an administration which does have advantages from my perspective, but that probably jumps off the cliff and builds the parachute on the way down. Sometimes that works.
But thinking on the fly and as a parachutist, I mean, hey, we all do that, right? You know what happens with the parachuting movement. So I'm not doing a lot of parachuting these days, but I've done enough.
Staying on China, they also have, and again, it's in a more open, purely democratic society, this wouldn't be allowed, although we'll see where things turn here over time. But China's data advantage, 1 billion plus citizens, effectively the country, China has zero privacy constraints. They could train, learn, enhance their systems on so much incredible data that they're having. We have challenges to getting that sort of data, and I would deem to be rightfully so. I believe in privacy and freedoms. But again, when they have an edge in energy production, when China has a massive edge in manufacturing, and then they have an edge on certain technological fronts, including the one I'm talking about now, they have some massive kind of pole leader positions. Yep. How do we address this? How do we play catch up? And where do we take advantages of where our strengths lie, broadly called the West?
First of all, China makes no secret about their policy on privacy. There is no policy. If you're doing something, the state has the right to know about it. And they extend that to their citizens that live overseas. And, when you want to start talking about China's behavior as it relates to information policy, tracking their citizens, whether they're in China or overseas, they don't hide it. They're not secret about it. There's no massive arguments for privacy, transcending either in China or any of the satellite states. I think that it is an important question for us to ask, understanding Chinese behavior as it relates to policy for privacy, why we didn't do anything with TikTok. This is a bee in my bonnet personally. China limits the amount of time that their kids can use TikTok. Well, what happened to either parenting or common sense? We knew that they were harvesting the behavioral and other analytics from the use of TikTok. And if somebody can explain to me how billions, if not hundreds of billions of videos of people videotaping themselves dancing somehow contributes to the overarching benefit of humanity, my ears are open. They're certainly big enough. But I think that the problem is that we can't be criticizing the privacy or absence thereof in China, when we ourselves allow the China state via TikTok to surveil our most vulnerable and of citizens, being our children. I have some real conflicts over this, and regardless of the acquisition or deal or whatever, if I would have been in the seat of power, and I had an understanding of what TikTok is doing, especially to our children's minds and driving addiction, I would have turned it off instantaneously. And why we let it proceed, I don't know. And regardless of any kind of acquisition by any entity here in the U.S., I don't know how we're going to get all the insidiousness out of TikTok as a platform, but maybe somebody here in Silicon Valley can explain that to me.
And broadly speaking, my notation on energy without guardrails, their building of nuclear power plants, a massive manufacturing edge that we're waking up to and making some inroads in the last year or so relative to the things I described. But we have a long way to go, and we have certain roadblocks. And let's go with the word checks and balances in this country and much of the West that makes it hard to compete when it's a totalitarian society, comes down from the top and they get things done very quickly. Certain things I got to tip my hat and respect, although that comes at certain great cost from a cultural perspective, at least what we're used to here in America and the West.
I didn't get the thread of the question there, Angela. Can you help me out just
How are we going to address the issue of energy is going to equate to intelligence? We'll get more to AI soon. They have a massive edge relative to building nuclear, and broadly, look at what they're doing in solar, let alone with manufacturing. How are we going to compete if they dominate on those two fronts?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So, I raced boats with the founder of SunPower, and the point of relevance on this is that SunPower is a company and is a technology which was founded here by Dick Swanson here in Silicon Valley. His ability to convert radiation into electricity was better than anybody else, right? And then he started to symmetrically compete with the Chinese because the Chinese were dumping their solar panels here in the U.S. market. And when Dr. Swanson went repeatedly to Washington to raise the case that this is unfair trade, number one, two, it's not very efficient, number three, China has no environmental controls, and what is the U.S. policy on this? We just let SunPower effectively get slaughtered. I think that if you take a look at what China is doing in particular, yeah, their air pollution is bad. Yes, their coal, utilization of coal is bad. I don't think they've come to the construct of clean coal. Quite frankly, perhaps I haven't either. But just go through the streets of Beijing or Shanghai or whatever. But I think what's really worth noting is that the behavior that China has had to acquire others' natural resources and to get their products into others' markets. At the same time, China is working very aggressively on alternative energy, right? And, whether it's wind or solar or nuke. I'm a proponent of nuke. And if you want to have a lesson learned of what happens when you turn off all your nuclear power, you can ask the German leadership. Because Merkel basically, decommissioned a lot of their nuclear power plants and then became dependent on Russia for their energy. That was a little bit on the short-sighted side. It is my point of view that China is going to keep driving their alternative energy markets, and they will use the revenue that they generate from offshore sales of said technology to buttress their domestic production and domestic utilization. I think that the U.S. Needs to have an aggressive energy policy. I think that nuclear has to be part of it. I think that solar has to be part of it. I think wind power has to be part of it. And, if we start talking about harvesting energy in space, which is something I'm taking a look at, there could be a real breakthrough because there's no atmosphere, right, in space. That could pay off hugely. And we'll get to this in a moment, but we are giving away key things as it relates to technology. We're giving away key things in space, and we'll come back to that. We have to have energy independence, but that cannot be all oil and gas, and that cannot be coal. It has to be all these other breakthrough technologies that are environmentally friendly, that have low costs are sustainable, and renewable. I don't see why that's not in the national security interest. And that's kind of where I sit on that. I think we need to mitigate the continued dumping of Chinese solar technology and solar panels in the US. And we should have an independent industry for that, period. And nuclear as well, period.
Of course. So we'll come back a little more to oil in the Venezuela discussion. But staying a little bit on China from a different perspective, the digital yuan, broadly the BRICS, kind of
Mhm.
versus the US
Mhm.
dollar hegemony, which has been the case since Bretton Woods in
Mhm.
1945.
Yep.
Broadly speaking, of course, not 100%, but the world settles in dollars. It's a massive advantage to the US, arguably offset some of our debt because we have such
Right.
trillions of dollars of assets and resources here in the US, and the
True.
world, for the most part, about 70%, settles in dollars.
True.
Is that going to face a threat, so to speak, from the central bank digital currency, which could be programmable, that basically not only it could dictate what we buy? Why would the world want to settle in a digital yuan? Now, we could get a little deeper into, are the BRICS going to start to back some of the resources by gold and other commodities? Uh, how do you see this playing out? And I'm going to bring it back to family offices now. Why
Yeah.
should they care about this? Are they overly dependent on the US dollar, and should they diversify?
Wow. Complicated question. So let me take a whack at it. All right, just bear with me. I think any forced devaluation of the dollar is a massive mistake. I think it is I think I have absolutely zero doubt that a strong dollar, whether digital or physical, is in the US interest. Period. Your point about the percentage of the global population that's actually, still reliant on, the dollar, it's accurate, and we should keep that sustained because dollar to dollar, dollar reserves in foreign countries is to the US benefit. If we allow the Chinese currency to gain a foothold, okay, I mean, as you know, they're doing a lot of their debt instruments, obviously pegged against their own currency, which only makes sense. Um, I really think we need to think about this. Devaluing the dollar is not in our interest, full stop. And losing the percentage of people who, for lack of a better way of putting it, subscribe to the dollar as either a backstop or a currency of transaction. We need to be doing more of that, not less of that. And I think our political strategy and our foreign policy have a deep impact on the willingness and the agility of people to adopt and or sustain their investments in the dollar. A run on the dollar is bad for everybody. That's my personal opinion. I'm also going to come back to one core point. China is continuously thinking about how to get more subscribers to their, industrial base, to their technology, to their capability to produce at low cost. And the currency is no exception. Everything China does is methodically considered and is the result of a strategy. And as you and I have talked about in prior conversations, both on air as well as off air, if you take a party that has a strategy versus a party that doesn't have a strategy and you want to place your odds, it doesn't matter how smart the person is, it doesn't, or does have the strategy rather. I'm always going to bank with the individual that has a strategy. And I don't see long-term strategy, especially strategies that are able to survive between administrations. And so because of our political system, whether it's, 2 years in the House or 6 years in the Senate, or every 4 years for the president, for the country not to have a strategy continuum, whether it's in technology, economics, or other policy areas, is an egregious mistake. And I think we can see the result of China having a strategy. They studied us, they studied Japan very carefully, and then they took the best from those, as well as Europe. And so I think that whether directly or indirectly, Angelo, what you're indicating is that these are all massive strategic questions, which most people don't have the patience to deep dive in. So again, kudos to you for hosting this forum. But we really need to think about strategies that can actually be 5, 10, 20 years, and not just related to the budgetary cycles. I'm looking at this as it relates to space and the duration of investment that we're making in space. And we need to be thinking very, very long term, not short term.
Well, I mean, of course, the politician's main job is to, one, get elected. They'll do whatever they need to do to get that. Two, likely to be reelected. And three, sadly, to probably profit and benefit, at least post their experiences in that endeavor. We do have to face some realities of the world, checks and balances that we have, limitations on term limits. Now there's a deep rabbit hole. We could go on that one come 2028. Maybe we'll save that a little bit later for the year with Michael as we get
another meeting.
Yeah, that's like I'm opening up enough can of worms. I don't need to make it more complicated.
There's a couple.
I'm gonna press you a little bit on what you just said from the administration. Maybe it was June, I think it was July, came out with the Genius Act. And actually, I think it kind of was pretty genius in terms of, and it may not be your ballywick, I get it, but I'll throw it out there, stable coins. And you hear Jeremy Alsteer, one of the co-founders of Circle, Tether likely needing to eventually come here to the US and get more, quote unquote, in treasuries. These are going to be massive buyers of the US Treasury, as other countries, including China, are not. If we are propped up, not backed by anything, quasi Ponzi scheme, until we figure this out, this may bide, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It may be rather genius. Have you looked into it? What do you think? Where am I wrong?
Number one, I'm not qualified to say if you're right or wrong. What I am qualified to say, and I'm going to twist your question a little bit, but I've done that before. My concern is a run on our treasuries, okay, and a run on the dollar. I'm concerned about a run on our treasuries because the dollar keeps declining. And so if we put our treasuries into these, again, I'm not an expert in this and I'm not going to pretend to be, but I'm going to try and look at the esoterics of the question. If we have third parties holding vast amounts of our treasuries and they are subject to volatility, I have some concerns about that. I don't think our treasuries benefit from being subject to volatility. I don't think the dollar benefits from being subject to volatility either, because those two different components of the economy drive so many different things. And for me, both as an investor and an advisor, when I do financial planning, let me rephrase that. When I do strategic planning, either for my own company or for my clients, they're looking at time horizons. Part of being a futurist, right, and a strategist is looking, longer than 36 months. When we're doing this forecasting that we do, we're looking at 5, 10, 20-year time horizons. And you have to have some degree of predictive stability that's not subject to volatility to be effective in doing this. I'm going to go back to the example that I had with the agriculture company and tariffs earlier. They've had to lay off a ton of people. They continue to lay off people. They're having trade problems. They just did a deal with Canada where 90% of the negotiation wasn't over how much money they were going to make. It was over scenario planning insofar as tariffs. And so I think that as a businessman, I think that to the degree that the government can drive stability, whether it's electronic currencies or physical currencies or our treasuries or our dollar, we have to do that. Otherwise, the economy, our economy will suffer tremendously. And the amount of uncertainty right now when it comes to strategic planning and critical industries, they need less chaos and more stability.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have as you could tell in the audience, a different perspective than Michael on that, and that's fine. I could always learn.
I'm not an expert, but I wanted to respect the question.
Building upon that a little bit, and I don't want to make it a macro discussion, but The last 2 quarters were incredible
Mhm.
in terms of GDP growth. Not okay, not good, like wow, but not really job growth. And that may imply AI agents, and inevitably, what is robotics going to do to that? But we may
Right.
get to that in the AI discussion. You mentioned tariffs from a little bit of a negative perspective. I look at it as renegotiating trade deals, which were long since needed. And I think the tariffs have been kind of incredible. Uh, I hear the president talk about, I don't quite know how they could pull this off, but getting rid of effectively the IRS and taxation as we know it. Bessent appears to be wickedly smart. This administration is more stable than his first. It's not firing people every couple of weeks. We could point out bad facts in terms of, or and we may get to that, that some may feel differently in Venezuela. Bad etiquette, calling people watermelon head and Pocahontas. I get it. It's not what we're used to in a presidential figure. And when I travel the world, may be respected, but definitely not liked. As American, I could kind of care less. But admittingly, I brought up positive points relative to GDP, my perspective of renegotiating trade deals and tariffs, and indirectly the prior question on stablecoins. I
Mhm.
want to hear the other perspective. I'm okay with Angelo. You're looking too surface level at the facts. You're wrong, and here's why. Again, I didn't want to dive too deep into a macro discussion, but tell me where I may be off so I could learn.
Wow. I'm not going to touch stablecoin anymore because I don't think I'm qualified to do that. But I am going to touch on tariffs. Um, so I did technology, trade and technology policy, right? And some of my advisory work, found itself to the White House, which was cool. And they listened and they read. And if you have the patience to read what I write, compliments to you.
I
Um,
understand, Michael.
you've read some of my stuff. I think what's really important to understand is that I don't believe there was any modeling that we ever did where we visualized doing tariffs against the entire planet or most of it. I don't think that that was something that we would have ever considered, 30 years ago or 20 years ago. I do not have a strategic and precise objection to tariffs at all. As I said at the beginning of the interview, I believe in free trade. I also believe in fair and balanced trade. And one of the things that used to give us fantastic headaches was both tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Okay. And I think we have to remember that tariffs or no tariffs, there's a lot of ways that we cannot gain access to others' markets, whether it's through the rule of law or, I don't want to bring this up, but I'm going to. The Japanese used to argue that they couldn't buy American rice or US rice because their intestines were different. Um, okay. They buy a lot of it now. But I guess where I'm going with this is that you have to take a more comprehensive viewpoint and less of a sledgehammer and more of a strategic and precision oriented viewpoint so that there's predictability with the companies that are doing trade with those nations. Um, I I do not understand precisely why it is that the construct that tariffs are being paid by other countries. The US companies that I advise today are eating a majority of the cost of the tariffs and or passing it on to their customers. And this is in extremely high tech areas and as well as agriculture. So I don't know where the construct of us as a consumer and as a citizen that we're not bearing the brunt of the tariffs. Are they generating revenue? Yeah, but it's coming out of our pockets. It's not being paid for offshore. And so, can tariffs be used surgically and precisely? I'm a huge advocate for that. I'm also equally an advocate for dealing with non-trade barriers or non-tariff barriers. Okay. And I do believe that we have had a weak hand in many cases with the WTO and GATT and other, regional trading systems or treaties, rather, right? But that's our fault. And as we pull out of all these international organizations, China's happy to step up, and they are. And I think that mind share and relationships matter. And I go back to the point that we have to look at the interrelationships and dependencies before we start burning bridges. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that as we came into this administration that the trade balance wasn't level. It wasn't. We knew it. But I don't even see how the U.S. Trade Representative, which seems to be invisible these days, the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of the Treasury, they're very important cabinet members, obviously. But it used to be the domain of the U.S. Trade Rep to think strategically and professionally with their staff, their professionals, and those individuals with ambassadorial rank who were also country experts on the countries that were giving us headaches to try and figure out how to solve those problems. It is extremely labor intensive to do one trade agreement and one tariff package or even one technology package, but to engage with, I don't know what it was, 60, 70, 80 countries simultaneously, I don't know how we can bite that off. I don't know how we did bite it off. And so I would kind of park the tariff issue there, is that you've got to look fundamentally and strategically and precisely. That's my viewpoint.
My comment, and we'll actually get to Russia upcoming in the next question. I hear what you're saying. I get it. We currently have a sledgehammer in the office that does have certain advantages at certain times.
Absolutely.
I may feel those times maybe now. You may have a
different too. And you know that on foreign policy. Absolutely.
You agree that the imbalances were issues for administration after administration after administration. We're relatively in the same age bracket. I do understand. No one ever, from my perspective, an amateur looking in, did anything about it. We finally had someone, a businessman at heart, that said things have to change. I'm probably going to make mistakes, but boom, here's the sledgehammer. And again, let's do that parachute on the way off the cliff.
My only really bad parachute jump was out of a helicopter, but because the parachute wasn't opening. But that happens.
That's a problem.
It was a minor problem. It was a hard landing, let's put it that way. Angela, look, I think that the U.S. For too long refused to look at the advances in Asia and elsewhere.
Yes.
And recognize that we not only had, and we're seeing this in space right now, and this is terrifying. We not only have China pacing us, in some areas, they're overtaking us. Okay. And so I think it's this concept that we had for so long after the Second World War that we can do everything for everybody and with a degree of largesse where we put U.S. domestic interests on the back seat. I do not believe in disengaging from the rest of the world. I think engagement is better. I think having back doors into governments is always better, especially in times of conflict. But were the relationships and have the relationships been out of balance for decades? You betcha. And my way of looking at this is fairly simple. When you're doing a company rollout or a technology rollout or a market rollout, you tend to start out with one pilot, two pilots, three pilots, right? And then you scale it. I think it would not have been, I'm not trying to talk about the rear view mirror here, but I think it would have been a good thing for us to focus on China and China only in the beginning and really nail that and really let them know we're not going to take your products that are subsidized by the government, that are not adhering to either labor standards or environmental standards that we have to use, right? I think there's ways you can do this that would send a wake-up call to the rest of the planet without engaging the rest of the planet simultaneously and leaving them adrift and confused.
If I could ask two questions that will be more quick hitting, including from my perspective in asking them, because I do think we have a lot of subjects to get to, but it'll help to put a bow a little bit on China and some of the things taking place in that hemisphere and cue us up in a couple of more minutes when we eventually get to Venezuela. So China, kind of Venezuela, our backyard play, 1,200 miles from US borders, 60 billion in investments in Venezuela. It's a massive amount of oil. It's a crude heavy oil with a lot of manufacturing capacity needed. But there's no question, I don't think, No one saw this coming, China and Russia. We're going to debate the merits of it relatively shortly, strictly from the perspective as I may be asking it, that you could feel free to place the question any way you want. This is not a good thing from China's perspective. And how do you think, as we inevitably queue up a Venezuela conversation relatively shortly, audience, I promise, that this plays into supply chains, dominance, and some of the subjects we've been talking about with the US versus China?
First of all, let me be clear on a couple things. I'm not a fan of the leadership of Venezuela for a long time, period. I'm also not a fan of the leadership of Cuba. I'm not a fan of the leadership of Russia. And let me be really simple on this. China is building things in our sphere of influence or sphere of vulnerability, whatever you want to call it, that are purely unacceptable, period. Period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts on any of that. Do I think that we needed to dislodge the presence of Cuba, Russia, and China and Venezuela? Yep. If you would like my personal 10 cents, does that oil have any real transcendent value? We weren't getting a lot of oil from Venezuela to begin with that was coming into Texas, right? And I, quite frankly, it's not really the best oil, around either, okay? Oil or no oil, should we have Russia, Cuba, and, China messing around in our backyard? No. So should we dislodge that? Yeah. I think we should be honest about it. I think to make it about narcotics or counter narcotics or all those things, none of which I'm an advocate of. But the fact that China's been screwing around in our backyard, I find it 100% not acceptable. And do we need to deal with it both overtly and covertly? You bet. I would use a counterpoint. Take a look at what China is doing in the Philippines. All right, an ally of ours and a long-term ally. Them building islands and then putting bases on the islands in effectively international waters. 1,000% unacceptable, not acceptable. But I think that we need to be candid and honest with our allies and with the American people about why this matters. And, I read an article, open source, by the way, this isn't obviously governmental traffic, that came out several days ago that mentioned roughly in the neighborhood of 2.6 million cyber attacks from China at Taiwan.
Wow.
A day. Now, a lot of Chinese activity as it relates to cyber, same thing with Russia and some other countries, is to break into the crown jewels of intellectual property, mostly on the private sector side. Okay. And they're doing the same thing to us.
Of course.
It's not just delay, disrupt, and destroy. It's steal and pilfer, and almost brazenly. I mean, you can see all the attacks coming in when you're looking at a network map. My analysis, Angelo, is multifold. When we need to do effectively acts of war, whether we want to call it a policing action or counter narcotics or serving a subpoena or extraordinary rendition, I don't care. But I think that when you're going to basically put American lives at risk, we need to be honest and forthright about why we're doing so. To basically kick China out of Venezuela, Cuba out of Venezuela, and Russia out of Venezuela, I'm all for that. But I think the American people have the stomach for that as well. But you've got to be honest. And I think that I'm not saying that anybody in Washington has been dishonest. But what I am saying is that we have to protect and defend the homeland, but not only on the physical front, on the military front, but on the cyber front and those things that we cannot see in space. Because if we lose space, we don't have GPS. If we lose our GPS, we don't have an economy. It's gone. We're back in the 1950s. And so there's all these multi-pronged things that we need to be looking at more aggressively and better financing, but we should be overt and honest about who we're in conflict with.
And Michael, kind of a follow up to that, is this going to encourage, prompt any words you want to use for China to do something similar in their own perspective to Taiwan? Talk about disrupting the world, supply chains, something called AI, space tech, as we're going to get to very shortly.
Mhm.
How do you think this could play out? Because again, they want to make the administration look bad, midterms coming up relatively shortly, elections in a couple of more years. I mean, in effect, I'm asking, do you think this year in 2026, we're going to see a move on Taiwan? If not this year, then next. And I know it's a clickbait question,
Oh, it's
but
not.
it's
No,
still a good one.
it's a very awesome question. I'm prepared to answer it. So I'm doing a lot of work as it relates to space and space strategy right now, Angelo. And I'm only drawing from my exposure to open source information at this juncture. It is no secret that China has directed the PLA, People's Liberation Army, which has control of their space assets, to be fully prepared for symmetrical activity against Taiwan on all fronts: space, cyber, physical, and other, and economic. That is a fact. And we have not succeeded in translating the industrial base of Taiwan to the US. That hasn't happened. And it may not happen for years. And I put some of this on the last administration. Some of the stuff that they were doing was just, I'm sorry, I'm going to get hate mail, which happened in the last interview.
Join the club, Michael.
Yeah, but I'm kind of cozy with that now. Look, if you look at a scale and a balance of power, true power lies in information. True power lies in things like quantum computing and post-quantum encryption and being able to defeat it. True power lies in things like artificial intelligence, biotech, gene manipulation, and all these other areas that require very smart people and very strong and very well thought out and very patient capital industrial bases. And then you take a look at the crudity of Venezuela. There is no symmetrical comparison. And so I think we should be putting 1,000 times more resources and the gold treasure and our men and women who serve in the armed forces and those who support them and direct them at targets that are highly vulnerable, that are at risk in the next year. If we lose Taiwan, that's not good. And unfortunately, with all due respect, whilst I believe in dislodging China and Russia and Cuba, I also believe that most of what Venezuela has to offer today is fairly low intensity, low value added, low multiple. Okay. I will not accept any argument where I'm told that Venezuelan oil is part of any supply chain. I don't buy it. Do they have a fair amount of rare earth minerals? They do. Are we going to get those? Not clear. But I would beg a similar question. And from October 2023, I published an intelligence forecast initially for the government and then was able to release it to the private sector, the commercial sector, and the general public. In October 2023, I made the argument that Ukraine had nothing to do with NATO. It had to do with rare earth minerals. The Russian economy is a failure. It does not belong in the G20 or the G8 or anything. Okay? It's a failed state. It's a dictatorship and a failed state. Sorry to my Russian friends. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that by letting Ukraine go, which seems to be the trajectory at this moment, and the rare earth minerals which are under the soil, that could re-lever not only the Russian economy, but put an entirely new portfolio of rare earth minerals into China's hand, which I don't understand why we would do that.
I did have a bunch of questions relative to Russia. In the essence of time and so much to cover, I'm going to actually ask a very simple, open-ended question. Effectively, why Russia? You could say Putin specifically. Let's go with Russia. Why Russia will never stop. Michael?
I think if you take a look at the losses that they had in the Second World War and then the losses that they suffered under Stalin, their appetite for casualties and losing people is at a point which is almost, and really, quite frankly, impossible for me to comprehend. They don't seem to quit. And if you look at the at least 1+ million people that the Russians have lost, just over the last few years, I mean, yeah, sure, they were, emptied from the prisons and, psychiatric facilities and things of that nature. But that to me is a lot of people. And so will they ever quit? All the Russians that I know don't quit in anything that they do. And they're certainly willing to play the long game, which, puts them in concert, certainly with people like the Chinese. Again, they have a strategy. The strategy that Putin had when he came into office is the same strategy he has today. The difference is he had a strategy, and he's not doing badly. For a country that's got an economy that's smaller than Texas, I may be getting that slightly off, but it's not very big. And yeah, they got, thousands of nuclear weapons, sure. But, the fact that they've been able to dislodge NATO and take such a, vast percentage of Ukrainian territory, which holds incredible reserves of not only petroleum on the low end, who cares? That's a low value added asset. Some of the rare earth minerals are trading at $22,000 a gram or an ounce. Either way, it's very, very valuable, and we need it. Are they ever going to give up? They've never shown any proof that they ever do give up. Do we give up? Yeah, because our thinking is too short term.
Well, then that begs the question, Michael, with due respect to how some people may take it. Of course, we know tens of millions of people lost in World War II, killed, rather bluntly. The fact, as you're describing, describes a unifying morality, a culture that is unified. We may disagree with it, but in some ways, you being a military man, we kind of have to respect it. Therefore, even if after Putin, never give up, with a country with the resources, natural resources, and nuclear weapons, as you noted, maybe more than any other country, that's a dangerous powder keg there.
Yeah. And I think that there is a way to re-level the relationship with Russia. I think that it is not advantageous to Russia or anybody else for Russia to be serving as they're not going to like this one. Look, effectively right now, Russia's doing the dirty work for China. Okay. And because they really don't have much in the way of an economy. China was buying 87% of Iran's oil. China has a strategy. Russia knows what it's going to take to survive. Okay. I believe that Russia genuinely would like to be part of the international community again and not be a global pariah. Okay, that's my opinion. But I do not think we make Russia's engagement with the rest of the world better by giving them a chunk of Ukraine. I believe that they should be held accountable, that the money which is, being held should be used to rebuild Ukraine, and I think they should be kicked out. If we start making it precedent in this century that you go take over a country and that's okay and there will be no consequences other than, a million or two people that you didn't care about anyway, I don't think that's in the global interest whatsoever. And I think that you could see, some of the formations that I'm seeing and discussing, go back to pre-World War II. And I don't think we want another world war by and where we have not only nuclear weapons, but so many different types of, weapons of mass destruction, whether those are cyber, information, or space. That's not to anybody's benefit. But we cannot be rewarding anybody who takes anything.
I hear what you're saying, Michael, and you're noting Russia lost 1 million people, but they're, again, unifying morality and culture that is kind of used to that. How many people has Ukraine lost? And there's no way that they can win a war of attrition with Russia. It may just be a matter of time.
Yeah. Um, whether you can, Ukraine can win the war or not. Let me flip your question around. Are we going to say the same thing about Taiwan and let it go too? What about Japan? What about South Korea? What about Singapore?
So you're saying that we put boots on the ground?
I'm not saying that the US has to put boots on the ground. I think we need to be transparent that this is not a morally equivalent conflict, and that Ukraine and Russia uh, are not morally equivalent on any of this. And I'm going to go back to the Obama administration. I think it's very, very clear to me that when President Obama said that he had a red line with Russia and Ukraine, and he did the same thing with Syria, and then the red line was crossed, and there were no overt consequences. I think it would be really fun to have a planet, where we could all actually benefit from AI and benefit from technology and benefit from good healthcare and benefit from some of these other innovations that we have and really upgrade, the education and the overall well-being of the planet so that we can actually migrate away from conflicts over oil or conflicts over water, or other natural, resources, and looking at human capital. The building that I'm in right now is dedicated to people who are on the cutting edge of AI and quantum and other technologies. These are companies I'm advising. And I would like to have more of the world actually focused on high value added activities that actually drive some form of, beneficial presence for the rest of humanity, as opposed to getting in the mud and wrestling and, doing trench warfare, which is the situation in Ukraine. But I come back to you, Angelo. If we let Ukraine go, are we going to let Taiwan go? Are we going to let Singapore go? All right. Are we going to let Japan go? These are really, really serious questions. And if we just tell the rest of the world that it's okay to take over a country and there will be no consequences, I don't think that's in our long-term or even short-term national security interest.
Michael, I did promise we're at the time now where we're about halfway through to our interview. Happy to take a little bit of a break. I could do a little bit of an Angelo infomercial to the audience. And if you wanted to tune out for 90 seconds to come back,
I'll be right back.
Get actually right into, to make Michael happy, everyone, not at the end. We're going to get right into space tech as soon as he comes back.
Thank you, Angelo. I'll be right back.
And audience, just so the live audience has a little bit of entertainment. Sadly, I'm not much of a joke teller. I do play a little guitar, but it's pretty bad. I'm tempted. It's a little close by. Whoo, I'm saved. Michael's probably only going to be about 90 seconds. One, I hope you're enjoying it. Keep the chat going. Feel free to ask questions. It's been a little bit of spark. We have some different perspective on certain things, and that's good. I am looking for more people that have a different perspective. Now, yes, I tend to enjoy a little bit of debate and angst and a little bit of uncomfortableness in interviews, probably more than anyone else in the family office world. You try to be, of course, respectful. And do I have some guests upcoming next week? So I hinted at a question for Michael that was unfair to him. Trump has hinted relative to abolishing kind of the federal tax. I have a guest coming on next week. Very interesting perspective. Canadian living in Europe, attorney by trade, thought leader on taxation, global issues, and effectively way deeper than this, but having fluidity, optionality in multiple countries. And very thoughtful. We're going to bring up the California wealth tax on billionaires. We're going to talk about Trump's, again, hinting. I just don't see it possible, but we're going to map out where it could be. Something on getting rid of the federal tax and what countries in Europe, what states in the US, what countries in LATAM could be good opportunities, second, third, or fourth options. So he's wonderful. It's David Lesperance. It's been about a year since he was on. I mean, I know he advises some of the most successful billionaires in the world. So I will be ready and it will be great. Other guests coming on, I will make some announcements over the weekend into early week, but I do look forward to it. I'm still going to do solos. I do enjoy doing them. And I will have travel hosting events in Miami beginning on January 26th, Family Office Day, where we're going to do instant response live simulations with me and other kind of fixers over kind of real life issues around geopolitics, cyber, investing, and other issues where sometimes things need to be resolved very, very quickly. People could be talented when everything is fine, but are you going to be good and calm under pressure when the world or your world is on fire? That's a very different scenario. Perfect timing, Michael. Welcome back.
Thank
On
you.
that note, since you brought it up and it's a creative and a great subject, I would like to go down the road of give me some context. We'll start with that. Define where we are in the US comparative to China and Russia when it comes to space. And then we'll cue off some questions from there.
Thank you, Angelo. So, first of all, I want to be very clear about my comments that the US is the dominant lead in space, period. But both on the defense side and the commercial side, what we do in the immediate term is going to have lasting consequences to space superiority and our ability to operate with freedom, whether it's in low Earth orbit or geo, et cetera. And really, what's happening is that it's obvious to everybody that space is important. And in 1957, we had Sputnik. Okay. And that was, when the Russians actually launched a little tiny satellite that actually put a radio beacon out. Okay. And that served as a clarion call to the US and said, we need to think seriously about this. We are so dependent, both on the defense side, national security side, governmental side, and the commercial sector, whether it's GPS or communications, all of our banking and trade, crypto. Okay. There are so many different elements of the US economy and the global economy that are now dependent on space that if you compromise our space systems, which could happen, then it puts the US basically kind of back into like the 1940s or 1950s technologically in many areas, not all areas, but many. And we're effectively crippled. And so where we are today is we still have a leadership position, but there's some fundamental issues as it relates to the infrastructure which supports space that we are not addressing, we are not budgeting for, and we are not making a priority. And this includes things like space servicing and in-orbit refueling. Most satellites are actually not launched with sufficient amounts of fuel to operate concomitant to the physical longevity of the satellite. Meaning to say that if the satellite has a 15-year lifespan, we may or may not be launching it with 5 or 6 years of fuel. Therefore, it self-obsoletes itself potentially halfway into its life cycle. And if you're taking a look at the reinsurance industry that insures space assets, and then they have to pay out business loss insurance policies because a satellite ran out of gas, effectively, right? That's not in anybody's interest. Now, there's a couple things that happen here that have to do with space and maneuverability. Back in December, all right, China launched several different satellites, and one of those satellites came within 650 feet of one of the SpaceX satellites. There was no bulletin, there was no notice that the launch vehicle was either going to go up or that the satellites were going to be deployed in the same orbit as the SpaceX constellation. Now, when you have a satellite crash into another satellite, it's not a good thing. It's bad, to put it conservatively. And if you look at the amount of people that are actually dependent now on SpaceX, that could have very nearly been a catastrophic event. Now, what I'm saying here is that satellites require maneuverability. If you have to take a conservation mode as it relates to maneuvering the satellite because you don't have enough gas, I'm using that term euphemistically, then that's not to anybody's advantage. And so it is the less glamorous side of space where we've dropped the ball. And as a country, if we don't change this immediately, we're compromising both our national security, and we're also compromising our commercial security and all the other downstream industries that we want to have, whether it's asteroid mining, exploration, and a million other areas, in-space manufacturing, pharmacological manufacturing. If we don't have the capacity to refuel our constellations, then we are compromised. Now, what China did back in the spring, I'm drawing upon unclassified sources. We have a high probability that they actually achieved an in-orbit refueling milestone between two satellites. And I'm not going to get into the numbers. I'm happy to provide that later to anybody who's curious. But this was a seminal event because they actually demonstrated it. Somebody observed it. And the fact of the matter is we haven't done that. And we don't have something similar happening until next year. And, moreover, as where China can basically dictate what their industrial base is going to do, right? We don't seem to do the same thing here. And so therefore, all these critical infrastructure components that make space even possible, we're not really financing and we're not prioritizing. And so whether it's Golden Dome or other systems, if they don't have the capacity to maneuver at will and do what we call dynamic space operations, quite frankly, we're at a disadvantage. And I would point out that any general who took their troops into war, made sure that they had the fundamentals. They had water, they had food, they had gas for the tanks, right? They had ammo, okay? So it's the ugly side of space, but the critical side of space, which is logistics and servicing, that we're getting wrong. And unfortunately, if you buy a Ferrari and you drop your million or two on the Ferrari or Bugatti or whatever, and it only comes with one tank of gas and it can never refuel, still want the car? And that's kind of the same situation that we have right now in space.
So you're basically saying to a degree that we're losing our edge. How can we change that?
Right. Thank you. Number one, it's not the glamorous side of space that we're losing anything. We have the technology superiority, full stop. It's the unglamorous side. It's thinking about, simple things like, how do we put gas stations in space, right? How do we have, vehicles like tanker trucks that can move from satellite to satellite to satellite to refuel them? And how do we do so in a way that's not proprietary? In other words, how do we make it platform agnostic? Standards are essential. The second issue is capital. The US government, the Department of Defense needs to start making this a priority. That means things like the Office of Strategic Capital. That means the president. That means the Secretary of Defense. POTUS in particular, as he's inclined to do frequently, historically, he could draft an executive order basically making in-orbit refueling a priority. And I think that's something which is really should be on the table. I think second is that if you look at a lot of the programs like the SBIR program, and the STTR program, which are designed to incubate and deploy and develop early stage technology, those need to be financed. But we, right now, between the public sector and the private sector, less than $100 million has been spent on in-orbit refueling. And if there's no capital, there's no companies. If there's
Could that be solved by private entrepreneurs? Why does the government have to get involved?
Because if the government doesn't do a demand signal that this is important, there's no VC or private equity firm that I certainly know that's going to get engaged. There has to be something to de-risk early stage investments for something this esoteric. The government has historically, whether it's drones or cyber or any number of other areas, showing that there's support by the government for particular technologies gives the freedom and the latitude to, let's get something straight. Having, been an investor myself and advising a number of PE firms at this point, they have to look at things with a degree of, conservativeness, because when they lose their money, their LPs lose the money and then everybody's unhappy, right? And then the time horizons on the return on investment On the inside are 5 years, but typically more along the lines of 7 years. So if you're going to have private capital coming in, that should be supported and buttressed and de-risked by the government. And the government certainly has enough money. I mean, if you take a look at the fact that, one F-35 fighter, not including maintenance, is over $100 million, right? Sure. I mean, for a few $1 billion, we could actually have an in-orbit refueling capacity, which we do not have today. And so I think that, I was dealing with in-orbit refueling when I was doing future casting 25 years ago. And I thought it had been done. I mean, why we were talking about it 25 and 30 years ago. And then to learn that it was something that kind of fell off the radar because it wasn't really fun to talk about. If you take a look at Tesla, right? So Tesla's got all these vehicles on the road. There's all these EVs out there, but the infrastructure insofar as recharging has been de minimis when you start talking about, scaling them out on a national level basis. So yeah, we've got the car, but if the car doesn't have the ability to refuel, recharge, et cetera, that's a problem. And so the government has to work collaboratively with the private sector. There's something called the Office of Strategic Capital that could be doing that, but it needs to come to SecDef and Secretary of Defense, and even to POTUS's attention. I think if POTUS actually understood that our space superiority could be is compromised, foreseeably, because we can't maneuver our satellites at will, I think it would be pretty interested. And in order for us, I'll pause there.
Me being my prickly self, I hear what you're saying, and it kind of makes sense to me. But I do have to ask, now we need to give more to Ukraine and other countries relative to help protect them. Arguably, my words, not yours, boots on the ground, potentially.
I didn't say boots on the ground. I want to be really clear about that. Yeah.
The government needs to spend money. They do a great job at that on the wrong things, of course. As someone, I can't say I'm a libertarian in the pure sense of the word, but I skew that. I think governments often get in the way and provide a little value. Milton Friedman's perspective of what government should do relative to defense, which could relate to what you're talking about, and really very, very few other things. I'm going to go back to entrepreneurs need to solve this, maybe some direction of the value from the government, but I just don't like to keep on hearing government, big government, tax dollars. I mean, hell, I want to get rid of the IRS, which I'll get to in a discussion on Wednesday. I'm not going to bog you down with that one, Michael. Now, again, am I saying this to be a little bit, I don't know if I'd use the word argumentative, but to just push back a little bit on what you're saying, probably a little bit. Where am I wrong?
Angela, I think you and I are actually generally in agreement. I think we just say things slightly differently. I'm not advocating any new capital allocations. But look, man, we had a defense budget that's nearly $1 trillion. Okay. And if we're not innovative enough to find $200 or $300 or $400 million out of $1 trillion budget for something which is a strategic necessity that, Space Force, Space Command, and the other unified commands have set as a priority, but they can't get a fair hearing on Capitol Hill. Look, for the cost of 2.5 F-35 fighters, we could have an organic, in-orbit refueling capability that then would scale with private capital. The private sector wants to do it, but SpaceX, which I have an enormous amount of respect for, and I think you know that, and we've talked about it. But their model is a little bit different for their constellation, which is up there right now, because most of their satellites are in low Earth orbit, are static, and when they actually reach end of life, they either move or they burn in. But that's not practical for a $2 billion satellite, that's in geosynchronous orbit or cislunar or other orbital patterns, right? And, I know a number of generals, both active and retired, and this is what they're going to tell you, Angela. So this is coming from their mouth, not from mine, the inability for them to be able to maneuver their satellites compromises their ability to do their missions. And whether we like it or not, war in space is going to happen. Whether it's going to involve nuclear weapons, who knows? Because that basically blinds everybody. But, we need the capacity to maneuver to avoid attack. We need the capacity to maneuver to avoid things like asteroids, or space debris or other things like that. And I hearken back to the notion that if we start having tumbling satellites, taking out other satellites because they couldn't move because they didn't have any gas, that impacts not only our national security posture, but our entire economic security. Now, I want you to think about something. What happens to this country if we turn GPS off, the timing and navigation systems, for a week? What is the economic implications of that? Because that is the degree of severity that I'm talking about right now, is that if you cannot move a satellite at will, think for a moment like a car sitting on a freeway that ran out of gas and they're in the fast lane. Okay? Do you think it's very comforting for it to just sit there? And that's all I'm suggesting, is that we have to have the ability to get it out of the fast lane and move it somewhere else. Without this capacity, it does impact both the national and the economic security, period.
If another direction of my question, which may be total ignorance, and you could reposition it, and again, tell me where I'm wrong. I think of the US government for decades, going back to NASA, and again, 50s and 60s, doing good things, but became complacent. Part of, my words, the deep state, slow, bureaucratic. And I don't know, this entrepreneur from Africa called Elon comes along and wow, what, last year he's got chopsticks, getting coming back down, into the SpaceX center from the satellite, whatever it was. Again, entrepreneurs that are heavily motivated with some level maybe of tax incentives from the government, but I'm just careful to go down the road. And again, maybe my ignorance on NASA, I'm sure they had incredible people. I'm sure there were things happening behind the scenes that I don't have the full picture on. And Elon, maybe I was going to say 1 in a million, maybe closer to 1 in 9 billion, maybe the greatest capital allocator of all time. Again, I ask from a perspective of my ignorance, where am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I think it's, again, you and I are saying different things, or same things, but differently. No one should refute the accomplishments of Mr. Musk. That's a fool's errand. Okay? Whether it's in market share, in space or other areas, to challenge the footprint that he has and the vectors that he has is ignorant. What I am going to also say to you, Angelo, is that, this goes back to one of the conversations you and I have had over the last couple of years, which has to do with bureaucracy. James Q. Wilson wrote the seminal book on bureaucracy, and it was called Bureaucracy, right?
Great title.
It was an effective one, right? But, I'm not an advocate of massive bureaucracies. I remember working with GM and IBM as well, okay? And I compare that to governmental organizations that I've worked with. And every large bureaucracy has a tendency to stovepipe, hoard information, make decision-making extraordinarily complex and untimely. So whether it's bureaucracy that's controlled by the private sector or the public sector, I think that periodically things have to be shaken up, always. I believe in that. I think that's why you change CEOs and boards of directors, not frequently, but enough to make sure that the, organization doesn't become complacent. Now, let me address governmental funding and buy signals. I think it's pretty important to understand that SpaceX has benefited from a tremendous amount of public sector capital and public sector contracts that were won and awarded to SpaceX. Those are long-term contracts that provide stability to the company, that allow it to grow and have a vector of predictability. I think it would be a fascinating conversation which I don't think I'm going to have anytime soon, Mr. Musk or his board of directors and ask, if you pulled out every dollar that you got from the US government, either in the form of grants or contracts, et cetera, would you have been able to do what you did? And all I'm submitting to you is that the US government is so large and has so much capacity to grant long-term contracts that private sector companies just really don't have the magnitude and the gravity to do. And so I'm not saying, my policies on taxation are keep it as low as possible. I'm also a huge advocate for R&D tax credits. I'm also a huge advocate for basically making companies that are actually creating critical technologies have radical tax breaks, full on. If it's a critical technology or a critical system that we have to have, I think we need to incentivize that. And you can see that with AI right now, even though there's no absence of capital. I mean, over 50% of all capital, driven towards investments, whether early stage or mezzanine or other, has gone to AI. Okay, so I mean, if you talk about fundraising for anything other than AI right now, it can be highly problematic. So all I'm saying, Angelo, is that the government has the capacity to not underwrite necessarily, but certainly provide long-term contracts. And it is my viewpoint for critical technology areas like what we're talking about with in-orbit refueling, the notion of shared investment between the public and the private sector, okay, and shared returns for the public and the private sector. We all win. We cannot expand our footprint in space on the commercial side until we have the ability to refuel. We cannot sustain the type of strategic operations that we need to have in space without the ability to refuel. These are critical national security issues.
Along with refueling, where are the opportunities for family offices in space and broadly space companies?
You said along with refueling, right?
Yes, I think we covered that pretty well.
Yeah.
So,
So
other than that.
So do I. Right now, it is my viewpoint, is that we should be looking at those ultra high value added areas that can function in space that cannot be as efficient or profitable or effective on the ground in a gravitational environment. Okay. Since we're basically clamoring for, rare earth minerals and the like, and things that can only be found in space, they've tried it, so far as, asteroid mining and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? We should be looking at that. We should be looking at data centers in space. We should be, and they are. This is happening in real time. This is absolutely happening. Okay. Furthermore, I think the other area, which is also, happening, is certainly, communications, not necessarily in the same vein as SpaceX, right, or Starlink, right? But there are other, communication modalities that are incredibly efficient without having to have a terrestrial infrastructure. So it is my viewpoint right now that those are all critical investment areas. I think if you talk to the CEOs in those respective industries, they're also going to be fairly clear about one thing. What impedes your range of motion? What impedes your business model? And that is making sure that the satellites that they put up in orbit, which are pretty darn expensive, okay, have concomitant longevity on the fuel side. And so I don't want to say the entire universe has to, or space ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, has to pivot to that. I'm not saying that. These are all long-term investment tracks. At some point in time, we have to have a comprehensive infrastructure up there in order to do our space manufacturing, which is going to be essential for missions to Mars, Jupiter, and outside of our solar system. So there's all these things that are ultra long-term investments. And you've got to have hyper-patient capital, and you better know what you're doing, because when we start getting and drilling into systems in space, it gets complicated very quickly. But to kind of recap, manufacturing, pharmaceutical show incredible promise, data centers in space, and communications would be my high point.
And Michael, moving on to Venezuela, we covered parts of it earlier in our discussion, though a little indirectly. I'm going to ask you a question that is probably a pinch unfair for any guest. You're getting enough text and emails and things, I'm going to make it very direct. Do you think Trump, and it was Trump's decision this past weekend, effectively capturing Maduro, do you think, and parading him through New York, I might add, with the van doors open, do you think it was the right move?
Maduro's a thug, and he needed to be brought to justice, and he was a proxy and a thorn in our side. I'm not an advocate of his, never have been. I think that if you look, decades, beforehand, the connection between Cuba, Russia, and Venezuela has been a destabilizing presence, not only for the immediate border neighbors, but for us. And then you take a look at the commingling between the narcotics groups and the drug traffickers and, tin pot dictators. Yeah, this is not, that model needs to stop, full stop. So, am I a fan of Maduro? No, he's a thug. Quite honestly, I think it's lovely that we have the patience to to put him through a trial. We have been doing extraordinary renditions for a while. Okay, I think that we, I know some people that are involved in that. There's a lot of bad people out there. I happen to be more of a fan of, snatch and grabs and taking people and doing so a little bit more on the less obvious side. That's my personal 10 cents. But at the end of the day, do I have any support for Maduro? No. And anybody who does is confused.
Okay, you and I don't really have much to comment on that. You and I are.
We're in sync on this.
Yeah,
I would have used a more delicate, maybe a more deniable touch, and then just had a manifest in that.
And I do understand from the non-Americans and maybe non-Western Hemisphere, it appeared over the top. Was it too much? I hear you, and I'm willing to listen to that feedback. I'm going to, maybe not quite as politically perfect as Michael, just disagree with that for a variety of perspectives. Did it interfere with some level of U.S. elections from a variety of perspectives? Likely the drug issues that Michael brought up, a variety of factors relative to unwanted, rather bluntly, influence in our hemisphere, and the impact of China even closer relatively with military to our borders. Now, was it also a play for oil and the $17 trillion of the world's greatest reserve? Although, again, heavy and very crude and very expensive to process.
And a long-term investment to get it out. Yeah.
Very much. You did bring up something. Very impressed, because most people aren't talking about it when you were maybe more indirectly commenting on that, and that is the rare earths and the other critical metals and minerals. And again, maybe looking at it a little bit from, it's to our benefit to work with them and have a level of control over that versus quote unquote China. This, I think, has been underreported by many who are discussing this, partially because of ignorance. I don't mean that from a really
sometimes reporters listen to me.
You
don't. It's not that I haven't told the reporter and the journalistic community that the great game in Venezuela is rare earth minerals. They just don't seem to be printing it. It's easier for them to focus on, seizing boats and stuff like that. But I think that the great game in Venezuela, insofar as resources, is clearly the rare earth minerals, number one. There's one other point that I wanted to come back to, Angela, if you don't mind. I think it's important to remind the American public and people watching this broadcast, and I know that you have people who are watching both here in the US and overseas. I think it's important to remind everybody that 8 million people left Venezuela because of the government. All right. And it would be nice to be asking those 8 million people what it's going to take to get them back, to rebuild the economy and get rid of the dictatorships and get rid of the secret police and all the other, Cuban thugs that are there. And what is it going to take to get rid of the Russian weaponry? What is it going to take to get rid of, China's footprint? I think there's so many different issues that are really critical. But again, I don't think it's wrong for us to basically say to the American public that the rare earth minerals that are in Venezuela should accrete directly and indirectly to favorable democracies and not be, sent over to China. I don't think that's an unfair thing to be observing with the American public. I think we can handle it.
Well, again, Michael, I don't really have much of a follow-up comment. Maybe my job is simply to ask questions, but it's hard for me not to have strong opinions, hopefully weakly held, and go a little back and forth with my guests. And thinking about it from a family office and investor perspective, being a poker player, hey, sometimes new information comes in. You got to change your hand. You got to adapt in today's world. I agree with you. There really isn't too much for me to follow up from there. Maybe my last question relative to it, because it's been so heavily covered broadly in the media and by families. Looking at it again, wearing the hat of the family office, what does this imply to you? Effectively, them going there, a pretty amazing military operation, and 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 extracting him. Maybe I'll use that word. I want to say someone else from other countries is next? Is this too heavy of a hand that it goes down a road that, again, who's next and who's next? And it creates complexities in some ways, even in our own hemisphere, although it feels good and appears from my perspective to be the right mood at the moment. But as a family office, as an allocator, someone who looks at geopolitical and macro issues and needs to make tactical decisions, admittingly, often long term, so could play out some short term volatility, how could this impact how I'm investing in what I'm doing?
Yeah. So first of all, I think any geopolitical events on the scale of what happened in Venezuela create a degree of confusion, especially with our international partners and trading partners. Okay.
Sure.
And I think that any kind of confusion, going back to the notion that we need to have long-term predictability in our systems, in order to make, capital allocations, headcount, et cetera. I think that any form of instability, politically, geopolitically, information systems, whatever, I don't think it's very beneficial to anyone. I do advise family offices and I do advise private equity and investment banks, period. The conversations that I'm having right now are more concerns over the fundamentals, being able to hire people that can read a book cover to cover.
Oh, no one does that anymore, Michael.
Well, yeah, and it's a problem for jokers like me who write books. But look, if we don't have a population that's able to do critical thinking at length, and then we've got all these other systems, whether it's social media or AI or other things, and we start to dehumanize ourselves, I think that's a really bad thing. Now, I want to come back to the economic growth issue for a moment. I had mentioned to you in a prior call, I think it was last year, that some of the companies that I communicate with and advise on matters like AI, right? And by the way, just to remind the audience, I've got 2 patents in machine learning, and I've been, knee deep and neck deep in AI since at least 2008, not to mention quantum and quantum encryption. It's not that I'm antithetical to any of these things, but I think it is premature for companies to be liquidating their labor base, their internal employee base, with the forecast and the assumption that AI is going to provide a panacea of any form or nature. Okay, I think that's a mistake. I think we need to be. But I'm coming back to the core issue on the family office investments. Okay, the stability of those investments is going to depend on the stability of the employment base, the tax base, and the ability to innovate with some degree of stability. Creativity requires stability. Venture capital requires stability. It requires predictability. Patient capital, same thing, right? So if we have complexities, like for example, as a small business, my healthcare costs have just gone up over 50% for 26 versus 25. Okay. And again, I'm a small business. But what I would observe is you start tampering with the fundamentals like an educated population base, a population base that needs to have stable health care. Okay, it is some of the basics, some of the fundamentals that I believe provide greater compromise, whether it's a family office or a large investment bank, to their stability and their return on investment. So my observation is geopolitical chaos is not advantageous to anybody unless you know about it beforehand and you can do something. All right. And I think that, again, my observation is keep it simple and keep it fundamental. It is the basics where we are failing. And no one party has a monopoly on that, by the way. If you take a look at education in California, which is where I'm sitting right now, if you take a look at healthcare, and then you take a look at us versus the rest of the world, we're paying the most for things. And quite frankly, we're like in 20th or 30th insofar as global parity rankings. We're also one of the most miserable countries in the world. And I don't think more chaos and more confusion and removing things like healthcare or education or access is to our overarching benefit. And so my viewpoint is to turn down the noise, give people a little bit of stability, a little bit of focus, so that the entrepreneurs that I work with can have some degree of predictability so they can innovate and create and make the new companies of the future.
Michael, we have probably ballpark about 20 minutes left. I will like to go a little bit into AI, then we'll likely wrap up with quantum. Where we last left off, I was intrigued by AI, was using it a little bit, had some direct, indirect investments in it. But as my audience who follows me know, I went very much hardcore last year into AI from a variety of perspectives, understanding US and China, geopolitical, global, societal, challenges to workforce, which I'll get to per your comment very shortly, investing in multiple layers of AI, and certainly from my perspective, which I've been wrong my fair share, it's growing rapidly. ChatGPT just launched a little over 3 years ago. And look at the version 5.2 now. Look at Claude's Opus 4.5, Gemini 3, and all those are about 6-7 weeks old. That's going to be old news in about another month to month and a half as the competition, which is always great, makes them better and better. But the big picture that I'm going to is what I hinted at earlier. Massive GDP growth the last 2 quarters to wrap up the year, yet the job growth has been rather poor, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
I look at it as when AI already, and you can't judge intellect totally on IQ, but the test that they were passing, the so-called Gemini, or was it ChatGPT's 5.2, 146 IQ, and the fact that I'm building apps by talking to them using Lovable, I'm building AI agents that are 24/7, 168 hours a week. They don't call in sick. They don't get in inter-office romances that get us all sued. And I think we're not there yet, but we're heading in the next year, year and a half, 2 years.
Sorry.
How is a human going to compete with this? It's going to get harder and harder, and that could cause a massive challenge in societal upheaval in the country and obviously really the world.
Thank you for the question. I think there's a couple issues. As a guy who's been a technologist in one form or another for a long time, and created new technologies that are on the street and have been adopted that have generated billions of dollars. I as a creator, as an innovator, I think it can be easy for us to get enamored with the creation and with the new technology that we're developing and fielding, without necessarily thinking about, are there guardrails for where this can go? Are there, any policymakers thinking about the societal implications? It is my viewpoint. I've done a fair amount of research and deal both with AI companies and quantum companies, as well as companies that are adopting AI that do not understand it or the implications of it. We used to think that some of the regulatory and, for lack of a better word, moral compass would come from the government, okay, through the rule of law or education and things like that. If you look at the volume and the nature of debate and discussion, the amount of attention which is being given to the amazingness of AI, okay, yeah, it's great. It's making everybody a hell of a lot of money. Cool. But what about all the people that have been let go, in 2025 and will be let go in 2026? Some of the forecasts, indicate, a loss of 300 million jobs. I don't remember the exact time frame, um, but it's not long due to AI. So, look, with every technology innovation we've had, you hear, well, they're not even bothering to say it anymore. No one's talking about retraining. No one's talking about, oh, they're going to be knowledge workers, and all this other ridiculousness. And, everybody's going to be able to, sit around and, think big thoughts. Well, tell that to, some 55-year-old data entry guy. He's going to reinvent himself. He's got a kid in college. Give me a break. I think until we actually, I have a really huge issue on this, Angelo. I'm not against AI at all, but I'm actually, if you want to do a trade-off analysis on where I sit, am I more pro-human versus pro-AI? I think I know where I sit. I wasn't raised by robots and I wasn't raised by AI. I was raised by loving parents and grandparents, okay? And I think at the end of the day, we've got to think about what our humanity is, what it means, and where we want to go with it. And I do not believe, I was in healthcare. I ran a healthcare company for 8 years, right? And if you take a look at the amount of energy or the amount of our brain that we actually use to do higher functioning, activities, right? It's not very much. And now we've created a generation, or will be creating a generation, of people who are addicted to social media, of people who are using AI as a crutch, not as an enabler, but rather as an absolutely moment to moment thing that they must have. And then the companies are just getting rid of people because it looks better on paper and you have more revenue and more profit. And especially as a public company, that's a good thing, right? I have misgivings on this. I do not see most CEOs, and I'll just get more hate mail and probably lose a client or two. I don't see a high echelon of ethics or morality when it comes to some of these, financial models. Again, I'm pro AI. I'm for it. I also believe that we need to look at the human consequences on this. And again, more hate mail. I live in San Francisco, and where I live, in fact, orbiting around me, we have thousands of Waymos, okay, which are the robotic vehicles, right? That are both a combination of AI and robotics, driverless cars, right? I would like to understand what the thousands of people that used to drive taxis or Ubers or Lyfts, have they retrained? And if so, is what? I mean, they were already, at a, this is not diminishing their value, but it's not like they were at the top of the food chain to begin with. So we're going to retrain them to do what? If you can't get a job as a driver, because now you've got thousands of robot cars, what is the socially redeeming value on any of this? And there's no thought, there's no regulation, but there's a lot of money. And, at the end of the day, if we have 50, 60, 70 million Americans out of work because of AI, then we don't have a tax base either because AI doesn't pay taxes.
Well, I mean, Michael, you open up such a can of worms. We could make that effectively a 2-hour discussion. I'm going to, after 20 minutes of us agreeing on everything, I'm going to push back a little bit on it. Again, I hear what you're saying. And on the surface, I think the audience is broadly going to agree with you. So I will be the bad guy. One, the Waymo experience to me has been incredible. We're going to see nuances of humans and us moving forward as a knowledge-based society, we're not going to have a 500, 1,000 IQ collectively that could be a 1,000, 10,000x Einstein. We're not going to be able to compete on that perspective. Now, we're going to be okay until robots are fully utilized the way that they should be in 10 or 15 years. So blue collar jobs and jobs like plumbing and electrical are probably good industries relative to go into in the short term. Not everyone is very creative or imaginative. Not everyone, although I love Peter Diamandis, but not everyone is going to be an entrepreneur like you kind of hinted at. I agree with you relative from that perspective. I could go into a deeper discussion about biology, about it's a competitive world out there. And yes, someone who has a 150 IQ is going to have an edge over someone with a 90 IQ. That's just how it is. That could go into a discussion about mating. Now, I'm really going off track a little bit here. My concern,
we're talking about technology here.
Well, my concern with what you're also stating is that, yeah, should we, even Elon said, are we summoning a demon circle and that odds may be 5 or 10, maybe even 20%, Jeffrey Hinton and others. But the train is not coming back to the station. It is a race between the US and China, and those are by far the only two, for now at least, that really matter. Whoever gets real AGI first and then ASI, artificial superintelligence, the weaponry they're going to develop, the ability to arguably create fusion energy and drive costs down in near zero, robotics will change the future of capitalism more so 10 or 15 years out. And everything is going to have to change. Will we have universal base income? Will the robots be taxed? There's things, Michael, that we're both, I think, pretty fluid on this, that we just don't know. The world is going to change. We don't have a crystal ball. Some of it may be worse. Some of it may be better than we're expecting. But as a family office, now I'll bring it back a little bit into the core audience after my going up on a little diatribe there. What could I do? I'm already invested in various different verticals of AI aggressively. I use it. I use AI agents. I create apps. It's been incredible for me. And I feel it gives me an edge and an arbitrage. And I teach that to family offices. But eventually, in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, it's kind of going to be a commodity. Everyone's going to have access to it. What is my edge going to be? And what am I going to do? I don't know. I know that I have to keep on adapting and being creative, using my imagination. There are times imagination is more valuable than knowledge. Knowledge, I may get a chip in my head and have all the knowledge I need from the AI. Not that I want to do that, but I can't say I'm totally against it. So I hear what you're saying. It's going to make you loved by the audience, the opposite of what you're saying. Maybe not some of your San Francisco friends. But do you see what I'm saying? The US versus China, the race to ASI, weaponry, bioweapons, space, AI, fusion energy, advances in robotics. AI is going to solve a lot of things. And if it's used by one country over who gets ASI first over the other, it may be endgame for the US.
That is such a complex observation that you just made. And I don't, even if we extended the interview by 2 hours, I'm not sure if I could give it justice. All I'm arguing in the immediate term, Angelo, is not shutting AI down, number one. And two, do I believe that our symmetrical pacing peer competitor that may overtake us for a bazillion reasons, right? Is China? Yeah, I do. Do I think? I think my broader concern is we should be very mindful with the unintended consequences of these things. And we're already seeing it. Years ago, people would bring their kids to me and go, "Hey, what should I be doing in college?" and stuff like that, right? And a lot of them were like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be, computer science and I'm going to do coding and all this other stuff." And I was telling their parents, I think that's a really bad idea because I think software code is, on the road to obsolescence. Now, if you take a look at, creativity and innovation and things like that, whether it's synthetic or whether it's human generated, there's I think there's really, only so many people that can do some of these jobs that have the foundational capacity to give you the range to do the creativity, to do the innovation. It's a gift, it's a blessing, and not a lot of people actually have the latitude, financially or otherwise, to do that. I'm not saying to get rid of technology. I'm also not saying that we don't recognize that we're in a symmetrical conflict or race or whatever you want to call it with China on so many different fronts, whether it's AI, space, quantum. Um, we have to be mindful of that. But the unintended consequence is that as we put all these things out into the ecosystem and they take on, for lack of a better way of putting it, a life of their own and self-replicating or engineering new systems, we need to do a little bit more catastrophe thinking on what this all means. And I'm both a futurist and I'm also somebody who does threat casting and wargaming and simulations. And there's so many areas that we have not even bothered to discuss or to contemplate. And AI, quantum, these are weapons of mass destruction, or they can be humankind changing things that have a beneficial presence as opposed to a destructive presence. Now, Joseph Schumpeter, the famous economist,
Sure.
had a construct of creative destruction. Now, I think if he had to write the book today and was talking about creative destruction, vis-a-vis AI, quantum, and supercomputing and all these other things, I wonder if the book would have been the same, because he was an advocate for creative destruction. I'm an advocate for creative destruction, but not with weapons of mass destruction in the wrong hands. And so I just think that there need to be more people thinking about both the upside that will benefit humanity as well as the unintended consequences. Technology doesn't deserve a moral barometer or to be put in a category of positive and or negative. Technology is what technology is. But when you give, simulated cognitive abilities to a system that's got a weapon, right, whether it's a drone or anything else, and you empower it to go do whatever it wants to do using its own self-judgment systems and programming, et cetera, without human intervention. I came across a discussion recently, and it was talking about, threading in AI into, nuclear systems. And with the construct and the foundational argument that there simply won't be enough time for humans to make the decision, so therefore we should empower the machines to make the decision on our behalf. That left my skin kind of tingling. And so all I'm saying is that we got to think a little bit more about this. With all the money that's actually being generated from AI and all the returns, et cetera, we should be able to field some, research somewhere that's basically thinking about, what are the guardrails that we need to have, while also recognizing the fact that we're in a symmetrical conflict with China.
And to Michael, the final topic, and we may keep it a little bit fast-paced, mainly on me, my issues, my bad audience, and maybe I still want to squeeze in 4 or 5 questions in a modest amount of time. Without further ado, I'll get right to it.
Sure.
Effectively, it's on quantum computing, kind of the end of secrecy. So the first question, adversaries are harvesting encrypted data like now, that they could decrypt it later. What percentage of billionaires, family offices, communications, privacy, secrets over the last 5 years should we assume are already sitting in foreign data warehouses? Maybe not, like I said, decrypted yet, but inevitably with the advent of technology and quantum AI, all of it combined, like, ooh, this is back again to a chaotic and interesting world.
You ask the simple questions, don't you? Yeah, that's a practice of, most, countries that have a comprehensive intelligence service, is to capture encrypted data and then store it with the concept of decrypting later. We're certainly no exception to that. It's my viewpoint that with an absence of post-quantum encryption, meaning to say systems that are either quantum resistant or quantum proof, right? Quantum proof doesn't appear to be highly efficient at this juncture, so therefore we go with quantum resistant. Okay, but what do we do about all the data before that? It is my vantage point that all hell is going to break loose, and the not so far off future, and a cascade of secrets and relationships and data are going to be revealed either privately or in mass, thrown out on the web, that is going to humiliate nations, humiliate individuals, compromise people. um, I there is really not a hell of a lot of, pardon my language, but there's really not a lot of discussion right now insofar as any of the consequences on quantum and its ability to decrypt data that may have been stored for 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? And the speed with which it can be done and the speed with which it can decrypt is scary. Okay. And to the family offices that are out there, there's an old adage when I was working in Washington, right, that if you can't afford to have it on the front page of the Washington Post, don't write it down and don't say it. Maybe don't even think it, right? And I think that where we are right now is that I do believe in privacy, and you know this, right? Strongly. I do believe that there are secrets worth keeping. I do not believe that everybody should have everything. I simply don't. I don't think it's in anybody's interest, especially when it comes to medical records or a million other things, right? So we have not thought through the consequences on this. Again, this is another situation where we find ourselves in symmetrical competition with China, even though we've been working on the technology for 20 years. What's going on in the classified world? Who knows? But even just looking at what's on the unclassified side, we need to really address this because it's not going to be good, and most people don't have any real true data protections, encryption, etc. And to leave it to the private sector to set the standards for the private sector, I think is a mistake. And I think we really need to be talking about things like this because the disruption to so many different echelons of government and society have not been thought through.
Well, I mean, related to the past 5 or 10 minutes ago, we spoke, I mentioned ASI,
Mhm.
getting that first, what could happen with energy going to near zero, eventually hyper advanced robotics, bringing labor to near zero, the changing of capitalism as we know it, practically inevitable somewhere within likely a 10 or 20-year cycle. But how about talking about that perspective, which you hinted at with China? China achieves, let's make that assumption, quantum supremacy first. I do believe we have the edge on AI and ASI for now, not on energy, not on manufacturing, but that we do. We likely, you're going to know more, don't necessarily have an edge on quantum. Do Western family offices, in my example, China gets it first, achieve is that going to be transparency to Beijing relative to the secrets of family offices, what they're doing, how they're investing in a variety of much deeper aspects than just that? Would you almost, if you wanted to do in a crisis simulation, walk us through a very abbreviated version, maybe a quantum enabled financial heist, and what it may actually look like in the relatively near future?
Wow. A war game in 5 minutes. Look, I think that fundamentally, if you accept the notion that unless you have quantum resistant encryption in place for your data and that you've got communications hygiene, whether it's verbal, text, etc., look, again, this is what people are not thinking about. Now, IBM has got some pretty good quantum resistant technology. Quantum proof is another thing entirely, and it's really arduous and data intensive and processing intensive. If you're running a family office, don't put anything on anything that has access to the internet at all on any kind of storage device, and certainly not the cloud, right? And if you cannot afford to lose it or have it compromised, then it shouldn't be on any connected device, and it shouldn't really be discussed anywhere. Meaning to say, electronic, transmissions, right? And the way you store it, whether it's physical or electronic, verbal, nonverbal, over the phone, etc. You've got the devices that you're using, right? You've got to be mindful of that. But unless I don't know any of my clients in the private equity side that can afford to have every one of their secrets actually on the street for a vast number of reasons, whether it's assets under management, or whether it's investment strategy, or deals that they want to get the jump on. I think that these are all things that everybody needs to be thinking more about, and more hygienically. I'm not sure if that's the answer that you're looking for, but if you can't afford to lose it, then you should, at a minimum, have quantum resistant capabilities, number one. Two is don't have it connected to anything, full stop. Don't be taking your computer to foreign countries and leaving it in your hotel room while you go and, kick back, a few beers. Bad idea. And, just common sense. And I'm not advocating paranoia. I am simply saying that unless you can afford to lose all of it, you've got to take those basic line, preventions.
I mean, for a family office with decades of experience, truly incredible connections, proprietary information and data, and really 50 years, in my example of digital records, of even complex international structures, multiple custodians, relationships, things they probably wouldn't want, quote unquote, released. Is there even now a true quantum safe? Is migration of that even really possible? Or are we kind of just rearranging really deck chairs?
There's no one easy answer across the board, Angelo. Um, without sounding parochial and self-centered, these are areas that we do consult on to those organizations that have, realistic, whether it's technology or finance or, investment strategy. These are things that require kind of a deep dive. And people that are on my team have, hands-on deep expertise in these fields. There is no one easy answer. There's no one solution fits all. We have to go in and do an environmental analysis, a behavioral analysis, a threat and vulnerability risk analysis. And it is only from doing the analysis insofar as the history and the as is that we can actually make some reasonable projection insofar as what the 2B should look like.
And perhaps my last question, then I'll give you a chance for some final commentary and how families, investors, family offices could learn more about your practice. And one maybe on a little more of a positive note, shockingly for me, Michael, but you never know. Beyond the threats that we discussed, quantum does promise, as does AI, revolutionary portfolio optimization, risk modeling, drug discovery. Should families be investing in quantum companies now, despite the challenges and the risk, which again indirectly relates a little bit to what we discussed prior in AI?
My opinion is that all the oxygen in the room has vectored over to AI, right? And other critical elements like quantum, space, other things like that have kind of fallen. They don't have enough room to breathe, right? For lack of a better way of putting it. I think that if you understand quantum enough to have a discussion with a company and not get, with all due respect, snowed, because there's a lot of that out there. There's a lot of people pretending to be quantum companies, and when you actually get somebody in that actually has some credentials in the field, you find out it's all, to put it gently, hyperbole. All right. So should you be making investments into quantum or PQE or other things like that? Only if you're able to effect the diligence that's actually required to know if it's real and what the path forward is. These are not the kind of things for a casual investor, and I think the risk tolerance has to be high too.
Of course. And for the audience listening in live or recorded, back in December, I had a wonderful self made entrepreneur and incredible investor and family office, JJ Sowers, on. And in the public session, about an hour and a half, Quantum did make it into, well, what are some public companies? And you mentioned one, IBM, but there certainly are others, Rigetti, et cetera. But my members got a private session that was about an hour with JJ, where he was much more open, because I wanted some exclusive content for my members as well. And that's the value of being a member. So, members, if you're listening but didn't watch or hear that interview, ask me for the shortened private version. But even the one that's public and up from, again, about mid December, maybe December 15th or 16th, was very good. Uh, because it's my first, Michael, of a long form interview of the year where we're kicking off the year, there are some. I want to share what's upcoming in January. But before I do that, you're my guest. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the work that you do with corporations, with governments, with family offices. And my focus, of course, is more on the ultra rich and family offices, potentially how they could learn more about what you're doing and interact with you.
Angela, number one, I need to tell the audience that what you do here is important, and is rare. And the fact that you have the patience and the diligence to put a lot of research and a lot of time into preparing for long form interviews is really, really rare. And I think it's important that you get a little bit of recognition for that because it's not common. That's issue number one.
Thank you.
And I mean it because we touched on a diversity of topics, all of which kind of matter. And so thank you for that opportunity. Number two, what do I do and why am I relevant to the people actually engaged in this, in the audience, right? More or less what we do is we come in to think about the future, think about what we want to think about, and think about those things that we really don't want to think about. And we take time horizons that are a little bit different. So we're not your classic, while we collaborate with other very large consulting firms, we're so at the edge insofar as the areas of expertise. And when you take a look at people who do both public sector defense and private sector future casting, threat casting, wargaming, and strategy development, there's a very small handful, probably less than a few hundred people around the world that can straddle both domains. And quite frankly, the domains between the governmental sector, the defense sector, and the commercial sector have a lot of cross-pollination. There are best practices that both sides of the equation actually hold. And that's why, typically where my company lands is in the areas of dual use, e.g. AI, quantum, et cetera. The name of the company is SedoGravitas. Look it up. SedoGravitasPartners.com. It's actually SedoGravitas.com. And the kind of engagements that we typically have, I'll just use one test case. We were asked to come in and take a look at why they couldn't raise a sufficient amount of capital, right? So we took a deep dive insofar as their long-term strategy and then figured out how we could actually use future casting, threat casting, and then strategy, and then wargaming to figure out a path forward. And we did that. And those are in some critical technology areas. Our typical engagements go all the way from very large enterprises, both public and private sector. We're international in our scope. It's obvious probably to the audience that I have a little bit of background in geopolitics and geostrategy and defense and security, space and other domains. But the easiest thing, because there is no one-off, is to reach out and connect with my firm and connect with me. The family office community is familiar with me. The private equity side, all the way up to the largest investment banks, are familiar with me. And so one size never fits all. Sometimes the challenges are technology diligence, right? Sometimes the challenges are organizational or financial. But again, the tools that we have insofar as future casting, threat casting, wargaming, and simulation can apply to both technology, to geopolitics, and to finance capital.
That is fantastic, Michael. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
And again, like I did hint up, Normally, I like to wrap up and I think keep it pretty basic. I may be a little bit more today relative to sharing what's ahead, including some programming that's going to be more open and digital for many of you in January, and a way that you could meet me in person. Not that you really want to do that, but my incredible guest, which Michael may be one of, we'll get to that in a second. But let me give you a little bit of context in terms of what is upcoming. So, one, thank you all for making it an engaging and exciting 2025, especially my members. I greatly appreciate you. I very much look forward to an incredible 2026. I am energized, I'm charged. I had a lot of projects and books and thought leadership projects that I wrapped up in December, and all of it is going to make its way mainly for my members, but some of it more open and publicly, broadly to my audience across my socials and other platforms. So in the short term, in terms of what's coming up here in January, what a great start with Michael Iris. So we were very fortunate. During the brief break about halfway through, I mentioned that on upcoming Wednesday, the 14th, if you're watching this live, we're going to have on in the afternoon David Lesperance. He's incredible. If you're someone, either an American or an international family anywhere in the world, concerned about some of the chaos going on, want to have optionality and residency and sovereignty, an attorney by trade, deals with multiple deca billionaires, and is one of the true thought leaders. We got so much to cover. The likely California tax, even on unrealized capital gains, Trump, Venezuela, Europe, LATAM, the US, New Zealand, Iceland. We got so much to cover, and he's incredible. So that's going to be live this upcoming Wednesday, I believe at 3 o'clock Eastern. And then Friday of next week, the 16th, I got someone incredible. One of the true thought leaders of the community, a Cambridge professor. We disagree on some things, and it's going to get interesting. And that would be Philip Markovici. He's a wonderful intellect, deep thoughts on government, on corporations, on successful family businesses and family offices, on governance, on taxation, on a chaotic and challenging world moving forward, and really one of the most high intellect people that I've ever had on. So yes, if you're wondering, Angelo, if you disagree with Philip, are you going to be a little bit overpowered? Maybe, but preparation and imagination could sometimes solve a lot of problems. So we shall see. And then the week after, next week, it might be something like the 18th or 19th, I have on Johnny Haycock. Johnny Haycock is a family member of Von Greyes. They're based in the UK and Switzerland. He is an incredible, thoughtful, and very, very dynamic speaker on gold. And I mean really deep, gold and silver, macro thesis, the US internationally, the value of Swiss non-banking, and we are going to go deep in macro. So I'm really going to let it rip. We agree and we disagree on some things. Hey, I'm a person, I guess that's my nature. What could I say? And kind of a little bit of my final comment, I wanted to share a little bit with many of you in terms of what's coming digitally. Now, in person, I'm hosting within another conference called Uncorrelated, a family office day, January 26th. I will be at the Ritz-Carlton. I'll be leading an incredible group of thought leaders and what I call a dream team. We're going to cover some of the before mentioned topics in macro and geopolitics, my Detroit paradox story, and really the star of the show is going to be upwards of 6 sessions on instant response simulations. Imagine Friday night, 11 o'clock, and this goes wrong. A cyber issue, a principal going under, a family dynamic issue, capital controls in your assets frozen. And we're going to have, now I got some experience with this too, but we're going to have some incredible, my private dream team of thought leaders. Michael may have fluidity in his schedule. He's considering it, so he may be one of them. And geopolitics will definitely make its way. But I've never seen anything like this of this scale for hour after hour in the family office world. It's going to be an incredible experience. Reach out to me if you want to learn more. Being a member is automatically in. Others, there's a little bit of an approval process. And with Uncorrelated, ALTS, the underlying conference. But I very much look forward to that. I host my marquee event over 4 days in Palm Beach, March 16th through the 19th. You could become a member. Go to angelorobles.com and be a part of my marquee event where everything that we just described, including some of the topics of coming here in January, you get to be immersed with these incredible people in person. And I love digital, but nothing, even though I love AI and robotics and all that, Michael is correct for now. The human to human connection, the nuances, the imagination we have, we're biological creatures. And until one day we're morphed into something else and a combination, but I'm still holding on to the human element. Like Michael noted, it's going to be an incredible year. I look to hopefully see some of you in Miami and Palm Beach. I'm going to do a better combination of my solo videos. I did a lot of them last year, but more deeper interviews like we did today with Michael. So kind of a fair balance of both. In 2026, I got a lot of things I'm working on, literally 2 700+ page handbooks in the family office world done. I wrap them up in December. My members get complete access to them. So if you're not a member and looking for something, I hope, truly special within the family office community, even for principals of a multi-family office, go to angelorobles.com, learn more, go to membership, and very simply become a member and be immersed relative in my world, my relationships, my private digital, my handbooks, my 850 question checklist called the Family Office Playbook, and the work that we're doing from first principles to AI, and the great thought leaders like Michael that I know and hopefully will be a part of multiple of our events this year. It's going to be a special year. We do have opportunity. You know how to get to angelorobles.com and figure it out. I appreciate all of you. I look forward to, again, a busy week next week, Wednesday and Friday with incredible guests. But what a way to start off the year with Michael Irish. Michael, you're the best. I appreciate you. I look forward to maybe seeing you this month, but definitely sometime this year. And appreciate you being my first guest in 2026.
Thank you, Angelo. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
My pleasure. Happy New Year.